So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio.
I'll never forget one of the times when I was a kid, a story that had it happened 15 years later, 20 years later today, probably would have gone a little differently. I remember, growing up in Southern California, we were in a Carl's Jr. drive-thru, and I was with some friends, and the dad was making an order, the drive-thru. Poor dad getting sent all of the food from the kids to the mother, all the food orders for that pack in the car. And as he's making the order, he's done, the person taking his order through the drive-thru, who, remember, can't see him, says, okay, no problem, ma'am. This will be your total, ma'am, and so on and so forth. And everyone in the car was cracking up because the dad was just mistaken for a woman, and it was considered something somewhat funny. Perhaps maybe might have hit the dad's ego just a little bit. Well, fast forward to just a couple years ago. Another somewhat similar story, although there was no real offense taken the way it is now. In Alabama, I was traveling. I was recording a episode for EWTN of a particular show. And while I was there, I remember I went out to Starbucks with, and I don't normally frequent Starbucks. Everyone's always going to send me hate mail for going to Starbucks. I actually don't go there. But I was there. We're in the area, and here we are, we're checking out at the cash register, and this clearly is a woman in front of us. And, according to the eyes, eyes can be deceptive today, especially in the culture we live in. You can dress and do your makeup up, and so there can be some confusion. But here, this person was clearly presenting himself as a woman. And the man I was with, older, probably in his 60s, he ends up commenting, and I'm not calling someone in their 60s old, I'm just saying older than I am, or older than the particular person who was checking us out. So he says, "Thank you, ma'am," very, very politely. It asked how her day was and so on. And the whole time, this person's clearly somewhat perturbed and ends up very rudely saying, "I am not a woman, don't call me that." To which the man I was with was very kind and very taken aback, almost speechless, didn't know what to say, and very kindly went, "Oh, I meant no disrespect, I'm so sorry." Well, sorry wasn't enough. The kind reference to the person being what he believed was a ma'am, a woman, and his thank you, nothing worked out well. And don't get me wrong, customer service, people can be really rude. I understand if cashiers can sometimes be annoyed and frustrated, but they can also be appreciative when someone kind and thoughtful and respectful comes up. Well, this person couldn't have anything polite to say, and I found it fascinating because this person was also extremely disrespectful to someone who was clearly much older than they were. What happened to a culture of respect? Even if someone, quote, misgenders or uses the wrong pronoun, it's fascinating that "I'm sorry" just wasn't enough. Well, fast forward again to just a couple months ago, I was at the dry cleaners. And on the hat of the person who was helping me with my dry cleaning, the person was not very nice. And the person also had a she, her little typewrite written onto the hat that the person was wearing. Now, apparently that was their preferred pronoun. That was their preferred gender. And in the midst of that, I find it so fascinating that as we try to create this neutered culture, we also try to tell people what to call us. We try to make it difficult for people to tell whether or not they're male or female. We try to make it difficult for someone to determine what to call us to begin with. And we're offended. The whole thing is fascinating to me. I keep thinking of how it's easy to have a conversation with someone normally. "Hi, how are you? Let's talk about the weather. Let's talk about what we had to eat today. Let's just ask how you're doing." These simple interactions with people who are cashiers, checkers, whatever they might be. As people of faith, we're called to be polite and kind. And I hope that that's something that you and I tend to show in our interactions with others. But for some reason, I've noticed when encountering people who have a certain type of gender identity that does not match their biological sex, well, they tend to not be very polite. And I think it's fascinating because it takes us to this crisis of what some people are referring to as a pronoun war, a pronoun crisis. Maybe you found yourself in the midst of this trend of people proclaiming and even correcting you and others as to their preferred pronouns. We see it in email signatures, social media bios. We see it in the professional setting on name tags, video conference calls, even in classrooms for kids and even college students. In fact, some universities over the last couple of years have insisted that a new student needs to give their chosen pronouns. And what's fascinating is in some instances, some people may even be facing disciplinary action from perhaps an employer or a school administrator if they vocalize their concern, misgender, or maybe even just avoid saying the person's gender or pronoun at all, which is slightly my approach, but someone really shouldn't be able to get away with accusing you of any sort of hate speech in this instance. In fact, if you're just joining us, you're listening to Trending with Timmery here on Relevant Radio. Thanks for being with me. Have you faced challenges surrounding this pronoun crisis? I would love to hear your stories and how you may have encountered this, or maybe one of your kids in a school setting. Anna recently wrote to me on Instagram saying, I would love for you to talk about how we as Catholics should navigate conversations with people who ask us to use certain pronouns and ask what our preferred pronouns are. This is something that I recently encountered with coworkers, and it's very uncomfortable. Perhaps you're experiencing this as well. It's not just California, it's Alabama, it's the Midwest, it is all over the nation. I remember I was surprised when I encountered this in Alabama. I've encountered it again here in the Midwest. It's everywhere. And the question at hand is this. As people of faith, as Christians, where do we stand in this crisis of pronouns, especially in professional environments when we're trying to be kind and merciful and respectful? Well, we have to stand on a biblical worldview. That is, understanding that the human person, you, me, and even the people who are confused about their gender identity, all of us are created intentionally by God in the image and likeness of God. God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't lie about who we are, and we shouldn't lie to others about who they are. You see, a person can change their name, but they can't change their sex. No matter what plastic reconstructive surgery they might choose to go through, no matter what types of hormones they may take or hormone blockers they may choose, no matter how they dress, how they do their hair, what makeup they put on, and even if they start to grow facial hair in places that traditionally shouldn't be grown for a person of that sex, or maybe they stop growing facial hair, or maybe their weight's redistributed, all these things that can occur through the biochemical manipulation of the body via drugs. And are meant to help heal people, not do harm, not change things. I keep thinking about this. Have you ever met someone whether it be in a professional setting or just a setting where this just seems a little awkward, where someone says something along the lines of, "Hi, my name is Catherine, but you can call me Kit Kat," to which this is where my parents would always say I was an old soul from a young age, would be like, "I'm calling you Catherine. I'm not calling you Kit Kat. You're not a candy." I could never understand when someone has like a really nice name, a fine name, nothing's wrong with it, and they're like, "You can call me Kit Kat. You can call me Kitty. You can call me Tinkerbell." Some people who, for some reason, Timmery just doesn't stick with them. I know it's a different name, would try to call me Tinkerbell. I'm like, no. Doesn't work. I'll say I hate it unless it's someone who's extremely close to me, extremely close, and I grew up with them, and I don't mind it being called Timmy. Unless you're my parents and my siblings, and maybe a couple of my cousins, I just don't like it personally. I digress. That's a whole nother thing. But coming back to the example, when someone, for example, says that, "Hi, my name's Catherine, but you can call me Kit Kat," to which I usually stick with Catherine. Why do I do that? And maybe you do too. Well, one, I don't necessarily like to play in childish behavior, or perhaps it's not a professional setting or the appropriate setting to do that. It's, in other words, inappropriate given the context. And also, it might just be that I don't feel comfortable with that kind of familiarity to call you a pet name. Now, for example, a person named Michael might prefer to be called Mike. Fine. that's the case, even though I think Michael's a beautiful name and I think that Michael should be said in its fullness, just like my husband. My husband's name's Gabriel. Everyone calls him Gabe. You know, they're beautiful names, and sure, okay, I can call you Gabe. I can call you Mike if that's what you prefer. But here's what we have to do when it comes to this gender pronoun crisis. We need to be real. Just like it might seem silly to call a person Kit Kat if you're in a work environment and their name's Catherine. This is where my go-to in environments where people perhaps are insisting on a certain pronoun or on being renamed something. Sometimes I do just concede, okay, you're George and you want to be called Georgina. Perhaps I'll consider conceding that. Perhaps. It's a little easier when it's a more neutral-ish sounding name. But what I find the easiest thing to do, because I can't misgender someone. I'm sorry, it's a lie. It's not telling the truth. It's feeding into what is not real about the human person. We're going to get into that more, into some of the theology here as well. But I do what I do when I forget someone's name. And you should know I do this often. I can be terrible at remembering people's names. I'm really good with faces and recognizing faces. Even faces, I probably shouldn't recognize, but names. Oh, goodness me. I have such a hard time. This is how bad it is. I remember even in college, I had like 4 or 5 roommates, 3-bedroom apartment, and I couldn't remember 2 of my roommates' names. Now, it was really easy because I think 2 or 3 of my roommates' names were Emily, and then a couple others I couldn't remember their name. So we called the Emilys by their state, and the other ones just weren't around a lot. And so I couldn't remember their names. I spent months, especially because I rarely saw some of them, trying to remember their name. And I felt like just totally stupid because I couldn't remember these names. Well, I kind of take that approach when it comes to these awkward situations where someone wants you to call them a name or specifically a pronoun that's a lie about the person and who they are. Just refer to them as, hey, you. You really like this. I'm talking to you. Just use you, even if it's awkward. Hey, just say, I forgot your name, maybe. And for all, intents and purposes, you addresses an individual. You can still be used as a sign of respect. And yes, it takes more intention, but just like when you forget someone's name, you have to remember to call them you all the time and not by that name that you think might be their name. So if I think someone's a Catherine, but they're really a Claudia, I should probably, if I'm not sure, maybe just use you until I'm sure. But this is where I think that we can try to make it not so awkward. Just use you. If someone approaches you and says, hey, I'd like you to use this preferred pronoun, you can just listen. And then when you refer to them, say, I really need to talk to you. You keep it simple. But if they then ask you for your preferred pronouns, you have the opportunity to say, I believe that people are made male and female. You can refer to me as a woman and all pronouns that go along with that. And keep it really simple. Walk away. And just say, I'm a woman. You can leave it at that. You don't even have to talk about how you believe people are made male and female. The reality is most of the time, the opportunity for a deeper conversation is not necessarily going to happen in these awkward situations. For one reason, you might be flabbergasted by the conversation to begin with. And so you might not even know what to say. You can just say, I'm a woman. You can stick with those pronouns. Who knew we'd be talking about pronouns so much? It's something you talk about when you're in grade school. So here's the reality. If you find yourself in a conversation and you are flabbergasted, it is awkward. This is my go-to, and I really discovered this when I started working in the situations with crisis pregnancy women in front of the abortion clinic, sidewalk counseling. I was 13 when I started sidewalk counseling. I did not have all of the know-it-all or the capacity to do everything to help a person in crisis, but I could talk to them, I could listen, and I could first and foremost call upon the Holy Spirit. So in these awkward circumstances, whether it's with a friend, a family member, a coworker, it could be a moment where someone's challenging you on their faith. They just told you they're pregnant and considering an abortion. They've just asked you to use a different pronoun to refer to them. The first thing to do is say, "Come, Holy Spirit. Help me because I don't know what on earth I'm doing." Trust me when I say the Holy Spirit will help you. He might call you to silence. He might call you to listen. He might call you to share something boldly. I don't know. That's God working in that time. Second, it's important that we listen when people are talking because we might learn a thing or two about why perhaps they're insisting upon a particular pronoun. I can't tell you how many times I'll never forget, I work in the Pilates world and dancer world, and I've come across a lot of people who identify as same-sex attracted and can act and live out a very flamboyant life. And I can think of one person in particular who, in living out this very flamboyant type of lifestyle, would also very commonly share that I have daddy issues. And he'd say it over and over again. Or I probably do this because my dad rejected me. He would actually, in the conversations that he'd have day to day, identify a crisis he himself experienced. A crisis having to do with his masculinity, with his father. And so what he showed he needed was male mentorship, affirmation in his masculinity. Well, perhaps those little things that we can identify by listening and talking to people might help, not so much in addressing the pronoun issue itself and whether or not we call a person he or she, but instead helping to meet a person with what they need. Maybe they need affirmation. Maybe they need someone to listen. You see, we as people of faith should not be targeted over misgendering, mispronouncing someone. But instead, we should be known in the face of perhaps not telling a lie or finding other means to refer to someone by just saying you instead of choosing their wrongly chosen pronoun, that instead they know that, hey, we're someone who they always felt affirmed around. They always felt listened to. That we were always respectful, even if they weren't necessarily respecting us or had even desired to have anything to do with us. Just like the stories I shared about being at the coffee shop or going to the dry cleaner. Like, these people were totally rude. They wanted nothing to do with me, but I can still show my respect, our love for the human person. But that brings me in, if you're just joining us, you're listening to Trending with Timmery here on Relevant Radio. We're talking about this crisis of pronouns, of misgendering someone in a classroom setting, a work setting, or maybe even in a family. Now, I want to talk for just a moment about some of the theology here because I think it's very important. Pope Francis himself has actually been one of the clearest popes yet in addressing the gender identity crisis. It is an ideology and it is a form of idolatry. When he discusses this ideology of gender, he discusses how it denies the difference and reciprocity in nature of man and woman, and envisages a society without sexual differences. He goes on to say, thereby eliminating the anthropological basis of the family. So what he's saying is, by suddenly calling ourselves by what we're not, it's creating confusion about the differences, and it's destroying the anthropological, from the beginning of the human person, the basis of the family and the context of the family and the purpose of the human person. He goes on to say this ideology, he says, promotes a personal identity and emotional intimacy radically separated from the biological differences between male and female. Consequently, human identity becomes a choice of the individual, one which can also change over time. So what he's saying is, we live in a culture where suddenly this identity based on ideology of gender is essentially leading people to have very emotional and almost intimate connections to what they believe about themselves. That's promoting a form of radical individualism. It's a problem of inconsistency and it's a problem of individualism. These two things, of which I'll comment, are opposed to what and who the Trinity is, the Trinitarian love. You see, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is a communion of persons, a complementarity. The male and female, the creation of man and woman provides a complementarity, provides a means of understanding differences, but the human person, even if we're made individually, are made within the context of a world, within the context of a family. We all come into the world through a family. All of these things show the importance of not isolating ourselves in an identity that is so individualistic that it ignores the reality of how we relate to other people. We are social creatures. We come into life through relationship. We come into life with relationships. And you see, God is consistent. There's perfect order in God. God created us and had an intention for us. And so when we create inconsistencies and this arbitrary change about what we identify today versus what we identify as tomorrow or 3 years from now, well, it doesn't follow or jive with a Christian worldview of the human person, or even understanding God himself, whom he created, you and I, in his image and likeness. You see, Pope Francis continues to go on this gender ideology. He says, "It is one thing to be understanding of human weakness and the complexities of life, and another to accept ideologies that attempt to sunder what are inseparable aspects of reality." That is, he's pointing out the problem of promoting a false reality, of promoting a culture of immaturity. Just like I said earlier, if someone, I'm in a professional setting and someone says, "Hey, my name's Catherine, but you can call me Kit Kat." Well, I don't have a familiarity with you. That's kind of awkward. But also in this setting, it's not appropriate. I'm not going to encourage an immature behavior in a culture that tends to be rather immature in terms of decisions, spiritually, psychologically, emotionally. You see, it's a false reality that we do not want to promote. You see, Pope Francis then goes on to talk about, he says, "Let us not fall into the sin of trying to replace the Creator. We are creatures and not omnipotent." That is, not all powerful. This is a reminder where we need humility in our life. This is why when I pray, I usually try to always begin my prayer by saying, "Lord, you are the Creator. I am the creature." In other words, you have a purpose for me from the moment of my creation. It's so important that we understand this. And it's important as people of faith that we need to help others let go of what's developed in this culture from, at times, childhood, where our fight or flight hormones are kicking in because we've developed past wounds or past modes of behavior, or even just the fast-paced culture that we live in that's led to these fight or flight modes of the human person where someone always feels like they're constantly having to protect themselves, defend themselves, that they're all alone. It's led to a radical form of individualism. And that, in a huge part, is due to the breakdown of the family. That modes of operation, modes of behavior, of fear and anxiety, literally stress hormones kicking in for people, are leading to confusion about identity. We see this in this generation of young girls suddenly coming out, identifying as boys and taking cross-sex hormones, and even eventually choosing cross-sex surgery. Sex changes, so-called, quote, gender affirmation surgeries, as they call them, which that is not what they are. You see, all of this leads to greater wounds from the past without healing the problems of the past. Pope Francis said that creation is prior to us and must be received as a gift. In other words, creation occurred prior to our actual being created. That there was a concept and then God created. In other words, he had a purpose. Just like when you and I make a scarf or attempt to build a chair, there's a concept, there's a purpose, there's a function. We are not accidents. We are created in an act of love, co-created by our parents, even if not intended, but always intended and allowed and co-created by God. You see, this third-party reproduction, fatherlessness, lack of intact families, the abortion culture we face, all of this has led to a lost sight of the value of new life, the value of, yes, the individual, but also within the context of the family. Pope Francis has said at the same time we are called to protect our humanity. And this means in the first place accepting it and respecting it as it is created. So what do we do to navigate this pronoun crisis as Christians? First, we have to recognize that God created the other person with a purpose and a reality that we must respect, and even when they may not understand it, show that respect. It also occurs by showing the respect of how we ourselves live our lives. Second, we have to value what is masculine and feminine in others and quit the criticism of the differences. That way people don't engage in a self-hatred that we're seeing in the culture about what is male and what is female. Third, we have to tell the truth when others won't. Perhaps not necessarily with words, but by the very way we respect others and ourselves. And finally, fourth, we have to love them as Christ loves them, as creatures created with a purpose to be with him. I'll be right back here on Trending with Timmerie to talk about this transgender crisis in women's sports, and we'll continue the great good news of Christmas.